Now we're in section 3 of chapter 1 for civics. So the standards for this, the first one is the same. The second one is compare changes in social and economic conditions in the United States during the 20th and 21st centuries. And we're going to discuss the history of the country, evaluate the changes in cultural ideas, and assess the information gathered in this section. So, the first thing we're going to talk about is the phrase e pluribus unum, which means one out of many. On the back of every American coin, you'll find the Latin words e pluribus unum. It's a reminder that many of the diverse citizens that make up our country. It's just an idea that we are diverse, that we come as a nation of immigrants, that we come as a nation that has been molded in a unique fashion over the course of the last 250 years, and not really longer than that. When you consider the colonies and how the American culture was really established. And so that's just a reminder, e pluribus unum, which means that we're a very diverse group of people. Now, this I got up here, I didn't update it yet for 2020, but as of 2019, on December 19th at 2:35, because that's when I figured it up. There's a website you can go to figure it up. There were 330,163,234 people in the United States, making this the third largest population in the world. It's believed the first Americans arrived on a land bridge that was joined Asia and North America, known as the Bering Strait. And we've talked about this a number of times so far already this year in geography, with the Bering Strait land bridge. Remember, the Bering Strait land bridge is believed to have existed where the Bering Sea is today, and connected the Siberian part of northern Russia with the state of Alaska. And it joined the two together, and it's believed that the people walked over and developed communities there, and as they did, they traveled from Asia over through Russia, into Alaska, down to North America, down into South America. And it's believed that's how people got to North and South America. And was the first population of where the United States is today, as well as Mexico, South and Central America, Canada, places like that. It's believed this is how people got here. Now, there's some other theories, but this is the most widely accepted. Until the mid-1900s, most immigrants came from Europe. So once that happened, it's believed that the land bridge disappeared after the last great ice age. When the ice melted, the ice sheet that was covering North America, when it melted, it caused the water levels to rise. And as the water levels rose, it covered that land bridge, making it not passable by land, cutting off North and South America from the rest of Europe and Asia. Now, until the mid-1900s, most immigrants came from Europe. The earliest settlers from Europe came from Spain in the 1500s and occupied the area that is now Florida, California, and the Southwest, which you can still feel the influence. And this is seen in the names of the locations and things like that. Like, for example, and as we're going to mention in a minute with Ponce de Leon, that Florida he called Florida La Florida, which means land of flowers, or land of many flowers. And so some of the early settlers are Christopher Columbus, which landed in the Bahamas, Ponce de Leon, which landed in Florida, and Father Juniper Sierra, which founded the first Catholic missions in Las Californias. And so some of these locations are going to be instrumental in developing communities that are going to even still be there when the American settlers continue to move. In the 1600s, settlers from France and England came to North America. The French settled mostly in Canada and around the Mississippi River, especially Louisiana. So what we see is, and I don't know if I've got the map on these slides or not, but what we see is that the French settled in Canada. But they also would travel the Mississippi River down the length of the United States. Mississippi River goes all the way down to the United States. and lands down in Louisiana. And so the French would settle in Canada and work their way down. They would set up forts and things like that all on the Mississippi River and down through Louisiana. And so the French mostly settled in those areas. The English settled on the east coast of the United States, forming the 13 original colonies. So this is what we're typically thinking about when we think about settlement in the United States and colonization is the 13 original colonies. This is going to be where our government of the United States is going to branch off from this, from the British that are in the East Coast. Yeah, this is the map I was talking about a minute ago. You see this blue right here? This represents the French. And you see that they have a lot more land than the English do. The British have this right here. This is the 13 original colonies. The Spanish have this area here. And let me move my picture. See, the purple is territory ceded to France by France to Great Britain, following the Treaty of Utrecht. And so that's just kind of dealing with the French and Indian War and the colonization of these areas. But the most important thing from this map is that you realize how much land the French had and where the 13 original colonies were located. That was the British location, the 13 original colonies, and the French gained all of this, which you're going to lose a lot of after the French and Indian War. After the United States gained its independence, it became known throughout Europe as the land of promise, encouraging more people to immigrate. So after the American Revolution, and I believe there's a chapter where we're going to talk more specifically on the history of the United States, but we're just kind of looking at it from a wide angle right now. Once the United States won its independence in the American Revolution and became the United States of America with the Treaty of Paris and England signing off, acknowledging the colonies as becoming their own country, people throughout Europe looked at it as being a land to move to. It was, and there's a number of reasons. There's a thing called primogeniture, which is where the firstborn son got the inheritance. And so because of this, there was a lot of second and thirdborn children that were not going to receive an inheritance in Europe and said, hey, you know what? All I got to do is hop a boat. They're giving land away in this new area and go there and, get some land. Because even as the Americans started moving out west, you have what was called the idea of manifest destiny, which is that the American people were destined by God to take over all of the continent. And because of that, you had the land grab, which was where they were basically giving land out west away. And so over the course of the next couple hundred years, really 100, 150 years, you're going to see between the American Civil War, once it ends, people moves out west. People comes from Europe because of things like primogeniture and other things, religious persecution. They just see America as a land of promise. And so a lot of people start moving there. About 22 million immigrants arrived between 1890 and 1924, with most coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, which would be the areas that really going to have the most immigrants moving over. During the last 50 years, the number of immigrants from Europe have lagged. They start to decrease. But Latin American countries, we're seeing more foreign newcomers from those areas. So where you have more people coming from places such as Guatemala and Mexico and places like that. Before that, it was all mostly coming from Europe. This is where a lot of people that, if you have immigrants in your family, if you ever look back in your family history, and like for example, I have Irish, Scottish, British, or English, that is mostly makes up most of my heritage. They're going to come over during this period of time. During the period of time where America had gained its independence, people start moving over in huge amounts. Some of the earliest immigrants to the United States were not willing. An example of this is the Western and Central Africans that were taken from their home and sold as slaves. They were sold into slavery in the Caribbean and North and South America. Some 500,000 people were brought into the country this way. And so some of the earliest immigrants to the United States were the slaves, and they were unwilling. So if you see anything on any of the assignments I've given you that said which one of the immigrants were unwilling, it was the African slaves. They basically, what would happen is that the tribal powers in Africa would war against each other. And whenever they would capture somebody from the other side, they would sell them into slavery. Now, early African slavery didn't really consist of what colonial slavery would turn into. Usually the slave could earn or buy their freedom a few years into their slavery. They were not treated as harshly, but when the Portuguese and the British started getting involved with the slave trade, they started treating these people as property and not people. And so because of this, this is where we see the slavery that's going to be an issue leading on up into the Civil War. They were sold into slavery in the Caribbean and North and South America. Some 500,000 people were brought into the country this way. The majority of slaves, most people don't know this, actually went to the Caribbean. Places like Haiti, Cuba, some of these different locations are going to have some of a lot of slaves, the Bahamas, because those are going to be very tropical locations, and they're going to be growing things there that you need a labor force that can handle that. And a lot of these African slaves grew up in the climate. It's the same type of climate. Remember we talked about in geography, there's different zones. You had the tropical zone. They grew up in the tropical zone in Africa, and a lot of these Caribbean islands are in the tropical zone as well. And so because of this, they were used to growing things in these tropical zones, and so their bodies could handle it because they were used to the work. And so a lot of the people was in the Caribbean because of this. Most Americans don't identify with a single ethnic group. Some do. But a lot of people have connections to a number of different types of people. Our ethnic diversity is matched by our religious diversity. More than 158 million people practicing some form of Christianity. The other major religions in the United States are Judaism, Islam, and Buddhist, along with many others. And we talked about this earlier in the year. Again, I believe it was chapter 4, where we talked about world religions. And we'll talk about it again next year. The major religions in the United States are Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, with Islam growing rapidly as one of the largest rising religions, not just in the United States, but in the world. The American culture is a rich blend of varied influences. It comes from a number of different groups of people. Even to the point of the slave culture is going to bring in some of the African traditions, along with some of the European traditions they're going to be mingled into as slaves, to form a different type. And it depends on where you're a slave at also. Because a lot of the slaves that were in Louisiana would develop a Creole type culture that would be based off of the French and not the British. And so it really depends on where you're a slave and who has occupation of the area, the cultures that are going to blend. But it happens all over, not just with the slaves, but in basically every culture. Immigration is not the only reason for population growth, with the population growing between 1830 and 1930 from 12 to 120 million. Fewer than 40 million of these being immigrants. This is mostly in part to people having babies. And let me point this out to you. This is a huge growth. And this happens during the American Civil War, which takes place from 1861 to 1865. So the population is going to increase from 12 to 120 million people when the largest war on our continent, I guess, the largest war on our continent happens and so many people die, it still increases this much. This shows you And 40 million of these were immigrants. So that's a very small percentage. Most people just had a lot of babies. And we talked about the birth rate and things like that. The birth rate far exceeded the death rate during this time. And you got to look at it. I mean, you look at families during this period of time, the colonial times, most of them had 10, 15, 20, 25, sometimes even kids. And they may have 7 or 8 of them die from a disease, but the rest of them grows up. And then they have 10, 15, 20 kids, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of people having a lot of babies. And a lot of it has to do with the fact of needing people to work farms, feeling confident. After the American Revolution, people was confident in the ability of America to be a prosperous nation. So when people feel comfortable and safe, they want to have children and raise families more. So that has a lot to do with it. Population has changed in many different ways over the time, such as in the mid-1800s, people begin to move from rural to city areas. You see more of an urbanization. And I've been talking about this all year, the urbanization in our world, that not just in the United States, but all around the world, people are moving to cities in mass amounts. Right now, it's about a 50-50 split between people living in the rural areas and people living in the urban areas. And so it's and I believe the number is going to continue to be lopsided, because early on, there was about 10% of the population living in the city and about 90% living in the country. That's swapped now to about 50-50. And I believe the urban areas are about to overtake the rural areas in terms of the majority of where people live. The way people live and work has changed over the history of the United States. In the beginning, Americans were farmers. Then it changed to manufacturing, and finally to the service industry. And so we see that people are starting off as farmers, and we talked about this. And a lot of this stuff we're talking about, we've talked about already in geography. It's just kind of a recap. They were beginning. It was an agrarian society. It was an agricultural economy. Then it swapped to manufacturing with the American Industrial Revolution. And then you see a swap to the service industry in the last 60 years, where more service jobs. Remember, service jobs are doctors, lawyers, actors, social media influencers. Anybody that provides a service and not a product is in the service industry. I am in the service industry because I am teaching you. And so that's kind of the idea. The places that people live changed too. For an example, freed slaves after the Civil War moved away from the South to other locations to have more options and a better life. So what happens after the Civil War, and I touched on this a few minutes ago, freed slaves, a lot of them moved out west. They didn't want to go north because there was still some hostility. We tend to think of this, at the Mason-Dixon line, and the North really liked people that were former slaves, and the South really hated them. And when it comes down to it, there was animosity on both sides. There was northern people that still owned slaves. There was northern people that still wanted to own slaves. But it was just predominantly in the South where the majority of slave ownership was at. There was also people in the South that was against slavery. And so a lot of slaves felt hostility or were treated differently when they went to the North. So a lot of them went out west and developed really good jobs. A lot of them got into law enforcement. A lot of them got into different things, different types of jobs moving out west. Migration, as we mentioned before, is movement, mass movement. Again, anytime you see the word migrate, this means to move from one location to the next. As people move and change, we are seeing the changes in our country. One source of unity among the United States citizens is the founding truths that connect us as citizens. For the most part, we're connected by the English language, as most Americans speak it. That's not always the case. There's a lot of people that don't speak English. There's a lot of people who English is a secondary language to them, and they may not be great at it, but they can understand it enough to function in an English-speaking setting. Citizens are free to speak any language they want, but a common language helps unite citizens. And this is the reason, too, why a lot of areas develop in cities where it's predominantly for Latino people or French people or Chinese people, because a lot of them there, they can speak their native language, and it gives them a sense of unity. Just a few terms. Patriotism means love for one's country. It's why people fight in the military. It's why we vote. It's why we follow laws. It's why we come together in times of trouble. It's because of patriotism, because we love the country. Most people are not going to go and serve in the military and say, I hate this country. I guess I'll go fight anyway. They're putting their lives on the line for this country. There may be some that don't like this country that's serving in the military, but for the most part, I can promise you, some of the most patriotic and honorable people that we have in this country serve in our military. Patriotism is why we vote, because we want a safe and secure election. And so because of that, we want to vote for our leaders. And a lot of that's been brought up to question during this past election. There's a lot of debate about, what actually happened, any kind of, cheating or anything going on. When it comes down to Americans want safe and free elections. It's the reason why we follow the laws. As I mentioned earlier, as part of being a citizen, you agree to follow the laws. And why we come together in times of trouble. Terrorism, on the other hand, is the use of violence to bring terror, usually to gain something, political gain, social gain, overthrowing a government, overthrowing a mentality, using terrorism to scare people to make it easier to take over. Basically, is what terrorism is. So that brings us to the end of chapter 1. Here with section 3. And so we're just getting started. There's a lot more we're going to cover in civics. And so buckle up, because it's going to be a long journey between now and the end of the school year. But we should have some good conversation about this. And I hope you enjoy this class.